Often when I'm speaking, I always say, if you're not in Smallwood, you're in the wrong place.
That's right.
So tonight, you can still be in Smallwood and be in the wrong place if you're not right here tonight. We have a very, very good program for you. And we have in front of us tonight, ladies and gentlemen, an erudite person who isn't just a good writer and a good speaker. He's a wonderful, wonderful storyteller. He's a great storyteller. And so I think John Conway has wisely decided to pick a topic in which he can actually, rather than talk about Smallwood, the good, the bad, and the ugly, he's actually going to do something interesting tonight for us, and that is to contextualize Smallwood in a way in which we normally don't think about Smallwood, which is in the bigger picture. He's going to talk about housing colonies and second home tourism and weave into the fabric of the county's development and birth how Smallwood fits into that. So it's not, by design, not a Smallwood-centric program. So with that, I want to introduce you to a friend, a colleague, and just an incredible storyteller and a wonderful historian, John Conway.
Wow, I've been called a lot of things in my life, but erudite? But yes, I do know what that means. So thank you all for coming out tonight on this beautiful evening. Some of you know me. I see some familiar faces in the crowd. Some of you may have heard me talk before. You haven't heard this program. And Jonathan was trying to cover for me, but let me be perfectly honest with you. He did ask me to do a program about Smallwood. And I declined because I'm sure there are people in this audience who know a lot more about Smallwood than I do. And I'm not really here to talk about nostalgia. You know, we can examine things through the rose-colored glasses of nostalgia another time, but we're here to talk a little bit about history. That's my job. I'm the historian. And we do differentiate between history and nostalgia. So I wanted to talk about housing colonies, second home tourism in Sullivan County, not just for the sake of talking about it, but because it was a really important aspect of our history, and it can also be important in understanding our future. And I think you'll see what I mean in just a moment. So let me just start out by saying that I am the Sullivan County historian, so my expertise is rather broad and maybe not specific to a town or a community. And we try to examine things and to attach some significance to them and to determine what is important to our lives today and going forward, not just looking back for the sake of looking back. So that's kind of my job. I've been the Sullivan County historian since 1993. Some of you may have heard me say this, and if you have, I ask for your forgiveness for repeating it, but when I was first named county historian, I would go to a group like this to talk, and someone would invariably come up to me and say, "Oh, so you're the Sullivan County historian?" I'd say, "Yes." They'd say, "I thought you'd be a lot older." And I always thought, does that mean they don't take me seriously as an historian? And it bothered me. But I have to tell you, no one has said that to me in a really long time. That bothers me. At any rate, second home tourism, what is it and why is it important? Well, I think in order to answer that question, we have to start out with a little bit of an understanding about tourism in general in Sullivan County. And let me say this about tourism, that although certainly there's a lot more about Sullivan County history than just tourism, a lot more than just hotels, and in spite of what people seem to be convinced today, a lot more about Sullivan County history than the Borscht Belt, it is tourism. And in a way, it is the Borscht Belt, which sets Sullivan County apart from thousands of other rural counties in the United States that would otherwise be very much like us. But we are very different because of tourism and our role in the American vacation. And one of the first things I did when I became county historian, and actually this dates back to before my appointment as county historian, I began to reconstruct the evolution of tourism in Sullivan County. It's something that has never been done. Prior to that, if you talk to a lot of people, and even some who you would think would know better, the idea that you got from them is that those 538 hotels that existed during our heyday here were always here. There was never a time when we didn't have the Concord and Grossinger's and Laurels, etc. And that's absurd, obviously. We know when the first hotel was, and we now know, and we can trace the evolution of tourism here in the county. So I began to construct a timeline. And I constructed this timeline about 1987 or 88. And at that time, when I look back at those years and think about my knowledge of county history at that time compared to what it is today, I think, boy, I was really working blindly, and yet the timeline has remained very accurate. And you're going to ask me at some point probably, why did you end in 1965? And for many years, I never went beyond that. We weren't really far enough along to look back beyond 65. But in recent years, because of folks like you prodding me, I have extended the timeline, and we'll talk about that in just a minute, and I'll show you the next slide. But let's talk a little bit about the evolution of tourism in Sullivan County, because I think it's important to understand this to understand the rest of the program tonight. Sullivan County in 1840 was a very industrial county. Our principal industries were tanning, and that's not tanning with the ultraviolet light. Tanning leather. We had a big bluestone quarrying industry, and these were fairly new industries. These both started in the 1830s, first tannery in Sullivan County, 1831, first bluestone quarry about 1832. We were still cutting timber and rafting it on the Delaware River. The D&H Canal was going on. That had breathed great life into the county. Those were our primary industries here. And yet an interesting thing was happening at that point that really no one paid a lot of attention to, it seems. And that was that we began to see an influx of people coming here to enjoy the area. And at that point in time, if you think about it, you really had to want to get here to come to Sullivan County. There was no railroad. It was not an easy trip. And we were largely cut off from the rest of the world. We've got the Shango Mountains, which even today is a challenge. We've got the Delaware River on one side. It was not easy to get to Sullivan County in 1840. But there were quite a number of people coming here, and principally they were fishermen. And we can trace this back to actually a specific article that appeared in a national sporting publication in February of 1832. And that article was about the largest trout in the world having been caught in White Lake. And it was a 6-pound trout, which at that time was unheard of. And because of that article, which was written by a man named Charles Fenno Hoffman, who was fairly well known at the time, some of you, if you know literary history, you may have heard of him. Because of that article, literally hundreds of fishermen began to flock to White Lake to try to break that record of the 6-pound trout. And they did. Pretty soon we had 7-pound trout. We had 7-pound 8-ounce trout, 7-pound 15-ounce trout. They were breaking the record pretty regularly. And these are brook trout. These are the original trout here in Sullivan County, and there were lots of them here. Not just in White Lake, but in the streams around. And people began to understand that, and more fishermen came. Because at that time, the 1830s, tanning in Sullivan County was in its infancy. And what does that have to do with anything? Tanning utilized, and the reason it was here, the hemlock tree. And prior to cutting down those hemlock trees for tanning, and by the way, that was the only reason they cut hemlock trees. No one wanted hemlock for any other reason. That's why there were so many of them still standing. even though we had been rafting timber on the Delaware River at that point for 80 years. But the hemlock tree was disdained by most of those early settlers. And they grew in such a way that they created canopies over many of the streams. And so the water in the streams remained very cold. Trout love cold water. There were lots of trout in Sullivan County. And soon we're becoming world renowned as a place to come fish for trout. And hundreds of people are coming into White Lake to do that. And at this point in time, a man by the name of John Beekman Finley, who had inherited a large part of land, a large part of the town of Bethel, from his uncle, John K. Beekman, decided to build a summer hotel just for these fishermen. And so in 1846, he opens the first summer hotel in Sullivan County. That's where it all starts. So around 1840, we have the beginning of the tourism industry here, even though our principal industries are really not conducive to tourism. They're extractive industries. You know, we're tanning leather, we're quarrying bluestone, we're shipping things on the canal, we're still cutting timber and rafting it. But for 25 years, this tourism industry is building. And at the same time, the tanning industry peaks during the Civil War, and then in 1865 the Civil War ends and the tanning industry begins to decline pretty significantly. Because during the Civil War we tanned more leather in Sullivan County than any other county in the Union. That's why they often say the Civil War was won on boots tanned in Sullivan County. They do say that. We tanned sole leather. And the hemlock trees and the water that we had here created a leather that was much preferred by bootmakers. It was a supple, durable leather. It was easy to work with. It held up well. It had a little bit of a reddish hue to it. That was all because of our hemlocks and our water. But at any rate, by 1865, things began to change. Tanning industry is declining. Bluestone has its ups and downs. But another interesting thing happens. America's been torn apart by the Civil War, but it begins to be stitched back together because every community after the Civil War, it seems, wants to have a railroad. And we begin to see railroads being built everywhere. Now, Sullivan County had actually had a railroad prior to the Civil War. The New York and Erie Railroad ran up the western side of the county as early as 1848. But the center of Sullivan County, where our county seat was, where White Lake was, not served by the railroad until well after the Civil War. But we begin to see the arrival of railroads in this next transition period. And the railroads begin to build tourism here because it's good for their business too. So a symbiotic relationship develops between the railroad and the hotels. The railroads are promoting the hotels, and in fact, they often go to the hotel owners and they say, if you'll add another 25 rooms on, we'll ship in the construction materials for free or inexpensively, because that's good for our business too. And so we see this tremendous growth of tourism, so much so that by 1890, tourism has become our principal industry here, far surpassing anything else. The tanning industry by 1890 is pretty much done. From 40-odd tanners we had here at the peak, we were down to one. Only one tannery in Sullivan County survives into the 20th century, and that was in Monticello. The rest of them were gone by 1885 or so. So tanning industry's gone, the railroads have arrived, and we begin to see a period we call the Silver Age. And the Silver Age boasts about 200 hotels. Most of them are located near the railroad. Almost all of them have some kind of natural beauty that they're able to promote, because that's what it's all about. And the railroad creates this notion of a healing environment here in Sullivan County by using for about 40 years this campaign, the promotional campaign, Doctors Say Go to the Mountains. Pure air, pure water, pure milk. Why was that important? Because New York City, where we were mainly drawing our people from to vacation here, was being ravaged by disease. The population was exploding due to immigration. The sanitary facilities couldn't keep up with it. Disease was rampant, one epidemic after another. And most importantly, the continuing epidemic of tuberculosis. Doctors say go to the mountains. So people were fleeing the city and coming up here. That was the Silver Age. Now I'm going to make a lot of general statements tonight. I should issue a caveat here. Most of what I'll talk about in terms of tourism, especially from this point forward, will apply primarily and maybe even exclusively to the central part of Sullivan County, the part that's served by the New York and Oswego Midland or the O&W Ontario Western Railroad. The Erie on the western side of the county created its own tourism industry there that never transitions beyond here. It stays kind of stuck in the Silver Age. And their campaign slogan was not "Doctors say go to the mountains." Their campaign slogan was "A sportsman's paradise." And they're drawing a completely different crowd of people. Now for years, I'm going to digress here for a moment, and I apologize. And I know I'm taking a lot of time to get into the second homes, and some of you are probably getting antsy. That's why Jonathan said he was going to leave the door open. For many years, people have asked me, and I had no answer, why did the central part of Sullivan County that was served by the O&W Railroad, why did that develop so much differently from the western side, which the New York and Erie serviced? The difference was that the central part undergoes this massive transition that involves the arrival of Jewish immigrants into the county. That doesn't happen on the western side. That only happens here. And people always ask, for many, many years, people have wanted to know why. And I always had a theory that it had something to do with the railroad. And maybe it had something to do with where the railroads originated. And then recently I was asked to do a program in Chehalis, Pennsylvania, of all places, and they wanted me to do a program about German immigration. They heard, someone in their group had heard a program I did here in Jeffersonville about German immigration. And they said, could you do this for us? And I said, I don't know anything about Chehalis, Pennsylvania. My German immigration is about Jeffersonville. They said, oh, just come and do it. So I went and did a program, and I had to do a little research, and I discovered something really interesting. I was exactly right about the railroad. So the O&W Railroad that serves the central part of Sullivan County, so we're talking about Mountaindale, Woodridge, South Fallsburg, Hurleyville, Ferndale, Liberty, Livingston Manor, Roscoe, etc. That's the O&W. And that's where the Borscht Belt comes. Why did that happen? The O&W, even though it's called the New York, Ontario, and Western, the O&W originates in Weehawken, New Jersey. I'm not an expert on New Jersey or even Metro New York, but I can look at a map and I see that Weehawken, New Jersey, where the O&W originates, is directly across. By the way, none of the railroads go into New York City. You had to take the ferry across to get to them. They're all in New Jersey. Same thing with the Erie. The O&W originates in Weehawken, New Jersey, which is directly across from the Garment District in New York. That's where all the Jewish families are working. The Erie Railroad on the western side originates in Hoboken. Anybody here from Hoboken? Anybody here know the history of Hoboken? Hoboken had become one of the most important ports on the East Coast for people immigrating to the U.S., particularly from Germany. Hoboken was known as a German city. About 1/3 of the people in Hoboken during this time of the Erie was being built spoke German as their primary language. Huge German population in Hoboken. And so I think that's what accounts for the difference in development. So what we're going to talk about today, to get back to our program, is the O&W side, the central part of Sullivan County. We're not really discussing the western side of the county and the impact of the Erie. That's a whole nother program. So let's continue on with our timeline. So we have this Silver Age from 1890 to 1915, 25 years, probably 200 hotels, literally thousands of boarding houses or farmhouses that are taking in boarders, literally thousands. Even as late as 1900, we had almost 4,000 working farms in Sullivan County. You can look it up. And most of them were taking in boarders to help make ends meet. That's our Silver Age. And that comes crashing down around 1915. And in fact, peak year for passenger travel on the O&W Railroad is 1913. And of course, everyone wants to know, so what happened? Why did it crash? Lots of reasons, we'll see that even when we get to 1965 and the end of the Golden Age. There are myriad reasons for it. Tuberculosis plays a huge role in the end of the Silver Age. And that's a whole other story as well, but suffice it to say that the medical profession, as we get into the early 20th century, begins to realize, the pendulum swings, that tuberculosis is a communicable disease, that you can catch it. Prior to that, most of the medical profession didn't believe that to be the case. So people riding on the train who were healthy weren't really concerned if the people in the seat next to them on the train were coughing and spitting. They didn't care. Can't catch tuberculosis. But once that notion changed, and it takes a period of years, it doesn't just happen overnight. Once that changes and you realize this guy's coughing and spitting and I'm sitting right next to him, those healthy people stopped coming. And the hotels go out of business, many of them. Which, by the way, sets the stage for this transition. That's what attracts a lot of the Jewish families who come here. These hotels and these farms are struggling and they're for sale real cheap. And the best story about that time period is a family that had been living on the Lower East Side of New York. Mother, father, 2 children, all working hard, can't make ends meet. Jewish immigrants from Eastern Europe. The patriarch of the family gets sick. When you get sick in New York City, doctors say, go to the mountains. Family scrapes together $450 with some help from the Jewish Agricultural Society. They come up and they buy a farm. They buy the Longbrook Farm in Ferndale. Their intention is to farm. He was a farmer in Europe. Forgot to ask some of the old-timers about farming in Sullivan County. They used to have a saying. How do you tell when you get to Sullivan County? There are 2 stones for every dirt. Very hard to grow things. And so they realize that farming is hard, but that first summer of 1914, they take in 9 boarders, mostly family members or friends of family. They gross $81. And that's a windfall for them. And they have a family meeting and they decide, this is the future, not farming. And it just happened that the matriarch of the family came from an innkeeping family in Europe. And so she knew how to run a hotel. She knew how to cook and how to manage. And so from that humble beginning in 1914, by 1917, they've outgrown that farmhouse. They have to put an addition on. They buy the property next door. They keep growing. By 1919, they've outgrown that, and they have to buy a much bigger boarding house just a few miles away on top of the hill, a place called the Nichols House. And their family name was Grossinger. And that's the story of the Grossinger family, and it's very, very symbolic of the immigration of Jewish families into the county. Not all of them became Grossingers, but the the gist of the story is very typical. So the Silver Age comes to an end in 1915, and we have this major transition that brings the arrival of these Jewish immigrants. Also the demise of the railroad, peak year for passenger travel on the O&W, 1913. The rise in importance of the automobile, all part of this transition. And so by 1940, we enter the golden age, 538 hotels, 1,000 boarding houses, 50,000 bungalows. Okay, lots of other things going on, but this is what we're concerned with. And by the way, if you just took a moment and read some of those things underneath, are some of the highlights. But let's move on here. I don't want to spend all night on that slide. So recently I've extended the timeline. People wanted to know what happens after 65. Well, the golden age comes to an end. And again, lots of reasons why. People always talk about the 3 A's. You know the 3 A's? Airplanes, or airfares, really. Air conditioning. The most important one, maybe. Assimilation. Jews no longer had to be around other Jews to feel comfortable. They were welcome in places that they were never welcome in before. Civil Rights Act of 1964. They could go anywhere. But I will also tell you that I think there are a couple of more A's in there. One of them, and I may not be able to think of them both tonight, but I apologize. But one of them certainly I think is the American plan. The American plan was passé, and that's all we offered people. Every hotel here had either the American plan or the modified American plan. You know what that means? It means you buy your package deal up front, you pay for your meals, your entertainment, everything all at once. You don't leave the hotel. Everything's paid for already. I think Americans got tired of that. We neglected to understand the evolution of the American vacation. I do a great program, by the way, about that, but that's not for tonight. So, 1965, the golden age ends. By the way, I think the other A is arrogance. Arrogance of some of the hotel owners who thought, this is never going to end. This is just too big to fail. You know, we had millions of visitors a year coming to Sullivan County. They were spending $50 to $100 million a year. This is all documented. And yet, now that we can look back on it, we can see as early as 1958, there are some signs that only a few of the smarter people in government realized. We've got some smart people today, and they understand that things change. You can't be aiming at the target that exists now. You have to be projecting. We're really good, and we always have been in Sullivan County, at jumping on the bandwagon. That's not a good way to build tourism. You've got to be a trendsetter, not a bandwagon jumper. At any rate, arrogance of the hotel owners, I think, contributed as well. So we enter another transition. And that transition of 25 years was a difficult one. And it took a long time. I have a friend, and he's Jewish, so he's allowed to say this, who likes to say, we spent a lot of time sitting Shiva for the hotels. We grieved the loss of the hotels, and most people here firmly believed that they were coming back. Guess what? They haven't come back. So we had a very bumpy transition period, but certainly not an uneventful one. In 1987, something really interesting began to happen in Sullivan County. We began to see some of the hotels who were struggling with their traditional business, building second homes. We'll see more about that in a minute. But it was right on time, 1987. 1988, we have a bit of a financial crisis, and a lot of those second home projects that were on the books never happened. And many of them that had already started were scaled back considerably. but it was the beginning of second homes. And so for 25 years, from 1990 to 2015, we still had a lot of people coming to Sullivan County. Lots of visitors were coming here. They were not staying in hotels. We had very few hotel rooms. And if you think about it, none of the Borscht Belt hotels were around in 2015. So of those 538 hotels that we had here at the peak in 1953, I think you could make an argument that every one of them was gone. So we needed something else. So if my timeline is worth a damn, in 2015 something should have happened, right? We should have been entering into a transition. What happened in November of 2012 or 2013? What was it? Very important thing happened in Sullivan County's history. Who knows? I'm not putting you on the spot, Mr. Doherty, but do you remember? We worked on it for 50 years. Casino gaming was. So 2015, we're building a casino. Now, personally, I don't think that's the wave of the future, but it lit a fuse. It started something here. This moribund economy began to come alive, and sure enough, we began a transition. Now, we've had a lot of boutique hotels open up. There's still one casino. I don't know how it's doing. Anybody here from the casino? I just want to make sure.
I just spend a lot of money there.
Trying to keep it afloat, doing her part. But I'm not sure that's the future, but I think it did spark something. So at any rate, this is the timeline. I think you got to understand it in order to know what's happening. So now we're going to go back in time here, okay? Most of the second homes that provide the bulk of the accommodations for tourists coming to Sullivan County these days are located in developments. Some are gated, some are year-round, some started years ago by struggling hotel owners who offered access to hotel facilities as an amenity to home buyers. That was not a new idea, as we'll see. But the concept of the housing development is not new to Sullivan County, and in fact predates the popularity of that notion nationwide, as typified by the Levittown developments constructed after World War II. So we predate that by quite a few years. And it all starts really, I think, right here. The idea of a vacationer actually purchasing a home in the mountains, as well as the notion of year-round living in a housing development, at least in Sullivan County, probably began with the novel approach of Arthur N. Smallwood in 1928. Smallwood envisioned a self-contained community, featuring not just homes, but recreational facilities, including a 90-acre lake and a golf course, and retail establishments. By 1960, it was reported that there were 1,500 homes in the community, which by then had adopted his name. He was not originally calling this Smallwood. He called it Mountain Lakes Development. But by then it was known as Smallwood. And about 1/3 of them were year-round, and some $5 million had been invested here. And that's in 1960 dollars, so I would say that's probably about $65 million today. And there's Mr. Smallwood. Now, let's talk about a little bit about Mr. Smallwood. He comes from Cincinnati, had some kind of a career in motion pictures, and many of you may know more about it than I do. Had a little dog that he liked to carry around with him too. But he envisioned, he's often pictured with his dog. He wasn't like my dog, who stands about this tall. He's a lap dog. At any rate, he envisioned this development. He was looking to make money. And by the way, nothing wrong with that. Bethel was settled originally. You know, Bethel becomes a town, really I know it's popular for people to say 1809. It was kind of organized in 1809, but it didn't really exist as a town until 1810. And I told those folks in the town hall, celebrate your bicentennial in 2010, not 2009. But they didn't listen. So they were overshadowed by the county's bicentennial. At any rate, Bethel was developed because John K. Beekman, who I mentioned earlier, had bought a huge tract of land from his relatives, the Livingstons, and he divided them up into lots, and he wanted to sell the lots, and he was a businessman. He wanted to make money. And he hired a man named Peck to live here in what we call Conneaut Lake today and sell the lots. That's how Bethel was settled. And he built a mill so that people wouldn't have to travel to have their grain milled. This is going way back, obviously, to 1804, 1805, before the county was formed, before Bethel was formed. So Smallwood's idea wasn't novel to buy up land, buy up these old farms, and to create a development. A man by the name of Solomon Royce did the same thing in Jeffersonville. He was a businessman from Monticello, owned a couple of hotels. He was also a surveyor. He owned a lot of land in the wilderness that we today call Jeffersonville, and he divided it up into lots. And he wanted to sell the lots to make some money. So what did he do? He had a great idea. He saw that there was a massive emigration from all of the republics that today we call Germany, because there were lots of things going on there. People were flooding out of there and coming to the U.S. And so he printed up some circulars in the German language, and he hired some people to go down and hand them out in Hoboken and New York City when these German immigrants got off the boat, selling land cheap. And they bought the land and came up. And as an aside, we can read about the fact that Royce sold these lots at a fairly reasonable price. They were fairly priced lots. But many of these German immigrants came here, and by the time they bought the lot and moved in here and cleared the land and planted some crops, which obviously are not going to grow right away, most of them had no money left. And they were starving. And it was only because Solomon Royce would make periodic trips through the development. And he would see, oh, this family's not doing well. He would either loan them the money to buy food, or he would go to a neighbor who had a little bit extra and bring the food over. And he helped them survive until their crops came in. So developments are a dime a dozen, but developments with someone who follows through and has an idea that is not just to make money, they do well. And Smallwood, I think, was one of those guys. He had a great idea. Now, I will tell you this, that as smart as he might have been, he wasn't as smart as one of his neighbors. How many of you know who Del Fungo is? Ever hear of Del Fungo? Who does? No one knows about Del Fungo. All right, let me tell you about Del Fungo. Because it's an interesting story, and it does have to do with Smallwood, and I think it's a great story. So Del Fungo is a man, Philip L.E. Del Fungo Guerra, owned thousands of acres of land, most of which is now under what we call Swinging Bridge Reservoir. He lived in Montauk Valley. Del Fungo was a con man. Del Fungo, dating back to the early 1900s, conned people out of thousands and thousands of dollars. He convinced people that he was an inventor, that he was a spy. He had a massive estate there, and he actually convinced the DuPonts, pretty smart people, the DuPonts, that he had connections with the German government that would allow them to sell through him lots of explosives to Germany. Probably not the smartest move. He had no connection to Germany, as it turns out. The U.S. government maintained that Philip L.E. Del Fungo Guerra was in reality a man by the name of Peter Brenner, who was the son of an auto mechanic born in Sullivan County, who had a history of mental illness. But he was a really good con artist, and he was always making money through these cons. He was in and out of court constantly. Here's one of his best cons, and it involves Arthur and Smallwood. and it will probably reinforce what most of you think of when you think of Arthur and Smallwood. One word that you would use to describe Smallwood, I'm sure most of you can say it out loud. A bigot, racist, right? Okay. We want to get that out of the way. So, I'm sure Guerra must have caught wind of that. Because Guerra hatches a scheme. Guerra owns thousands of acres adjacent to Smallwood's development here. And he's trying to sell the land. That's what he wants to do. He wants to sell the land. So he hires a couple of African Americans. And they come and they start clearing some of his land very close to the Smallwood border. And then he brings up some African Americans from New York City to look at the land. And they're not just any African Americans. According to the New York Times, these men were associates of Father Divine. How many of you know Father Divine? Well, you're an old guy then. Father Divine was a feared presence in America back then. He was an African American who was uniting the African American community. He claimed that he was God, or at least Jesus Christ, I'm not sure which. But anyway, so these men were reputed to be associated with Father Divine, and they're up looking at Guerra's property, which is now being cleared, and they're interested in purchasing several hundred acres from Guerra. And this all comes to light because a few of these African American men are arrested for walking or driving, depends on which story you ascribe to, on Smallwood's private roads. And they stand out like a sore thumb. And so they're arrested by the private security here. And then they're trying to get them arraigned. And of course, Guerra hires an attorney for them, who's trying to convince the Smallwood people, you don't want to prosecute these guys. What you really want is to get an injunction against them continuing to clear this property. So the story's all beginning to take on the appearance of a con. Make a long story short, Smallwood ends up buying 1,500 acres from Guerra because he doesn't want Father Divine owning the property and building an African American housing community on the border of his development. Now, this was never actually revealed as a con, but I have to believe, and I probably have researched Guerra more than anybody, this was one of his cons. He sold this land by conning Smallwood, by convincing him that there were going to be African Americans, and not just any African Americans, but associates of Father Divine, living, camping, setting up shop on the border of his development. So that's one of the great stories surrounding A.F. Smallwood. And Guerra, by the way, that was not his last con. His cons continued. I think that they're too numerous to get into tonight. I've written about it quite a few times. But at any rate, let's get back to Smallwood. So this is from his promotional pamphlet for the Mountain Lakes Country Club. Here in a mountain paradise, free from the distractions of the outside world, you will know you have found what you have been seeking. Here you will find smiling faces and contentment at every turn. Here you will quickly realize why so many lasting friendships are developed at Smallwood, and why very few people who visit it fail to make it their vacation home for all time. You got to give it to him. He does have quite a way with words, right? So he creates this community that we know today. And I think that building is still there, right? So that's the main gate back in those days. And you can see Guides Lodge, stop here for information, present your admittance card. So this was a closed development. And yes, numerous mentions in the pamphlets, in the brochures, in the promotional literature of the right kind of people, Christian, etc., etc. He made no secret of that. And by the way, up until World War II, every single hotel in Sullivan County was either Jewish or Gentile. They were not mixed. There were restrictions. And this started back from the very first Jewish hotel that came to Sullivan County in 1899. John Gerson's Rock Hill Boarding House was the first to advertise for Jewish clientele. And from that point forward, it was very common for hotel advertisements to say, no Hebrews or consumptives accommodated. Or under Hebrew management. They were one or the other. And by the way, that's the word to keep in mind, Hebrew. That's what was used all the time. And I will tell you right now that no hotel, at least in 40 years of research that I've done, and I probably know more about the hotels than any person alive today, no hotel that I have ever seen, despite many people telling me this happened, ever had a sign or an advertisement that said, no dogs, no Jews. That didn't happen. The word was Hebrews. That's what they used. And they were very blatant about it. And this was every hotel. Was either no Hebrews or consumptives. By the way, consumptives are people with tuberculosis. No Hebrews or consumptives accommodated or under Hebrew management. And that was for decades. And then they would gradually get a little more subtle about their restrictions. And so as we get into the 30s, they would probably say something like conveniently located to Catholic and Protestant churches. Meant the same thing. And a Jewish hotel would say dietary laws observed. Code words, but you knew what it was. And yes, there was a green book for Jewish vacationers. I think it was actually called the Blue Book, but it was similar. We've all seen the movie, The Green Book, right? Yeah. There was a green book for Jewish vacationers. But at any rate, so the Smallwood concept of a Christian housing development was not a new thing in 1928. Every hotel here was restricted, one way or the other. That was the way of the world then. And it wasn't until 1940, maybe during the war and certainly after the war, we don't see those advertisements anymore. Those restrictions are gone. Now, I'm not saying that every hotel was mixed after that, but they just weren't as obvious about it. And in fact, Grossinger's will tell you that during their heyday in the 50s, 1/3 of their clientele was not Jewish. Our golden age happens, that golden age from 1940 to 1965, that time period when we had the 538 hotels and the 50,000 bungalows, that happens after the restrictions are gone. People are able to mix. That's, I think, why we had the golden age. So at any rate, it wasn't that big a deal. And by the way, to get back to the African-American thing, when that happened in 1930, when Guerra pulled that con, there were probably a lot of people in Sullivan County who had never seen an African-American before. Because in 1930, less than 0.25% of the population in Sullivan County was African-American. And that would not change for many years, significantly. It's not until the 1950s that we begin to see an influx of African Americans here, and that comes about when the hotels begin to operate year-round. And they can no longer depend on college students for help. They've got to bring help in from elsewhere. And it all starts at the Hotel Brickman. Ben Posner is called aside one day by his chef, a man by the name of Sam Marin. Sam Marin says, you know, I work in the wintertime down in Florida. Lots of African Americans from Alabama work in the resort industry there in the winter. In the summer, they have no work. Why don't you bring them up? They'll come up here to work year-round for you. So he does. He sends some money down to some people that Sam Marin knows, and we begin to see an influx of African American families from just a couple of towns in Alabama. Uniontown, Bay Minette. You go to Fallsburg today, you talk to some of the older African American families in Fallsburg, they'll tell you, yeah, ancestors are from Uniontown. They came up to work in the hotels. That's where it starts. So Smallwood, obviously, more than just houses, right? This is the retail part of Smallwood. They had a Royal store here, a Royal Scarlet store, didn't they? Royal Scarlet. That was a chain back then, a lot of those around, small towns. The community that quickly became known simply as Smallwood comprised the post office, community lodges, cabins where relatives and members could stay for a fee, a departmentalized community store carrying everything from home furnishings to groceries, a barbershop, a beauty parlor, an outdoor movie theater, golf course, a swimming pool, a tennis court, and a lake for fishing and boating. The golf course was very popular. I had friends who used to come and play golf here from time to time. It was open to the public at one point at least. Oh my God, there it is. Who would have thought? Great views. I have no idea. Did anybody play on the course? Was it a good course?
It was $3 last time we played.
$25 a season for a junior membership.
Did they have a caddy?
Yeah,
They had caddies?
and I was a caddy for a while.
Really? Well, as long as we're sharing stories, I caddied at the Concord for about 2 days. Ray Parker himself fired me. Not just me. It's a long story, but he fired a bunch of us who were not, he didn't think we were old enough to be caddying, so he fired us all. One of the best days of my life, really. I hated caddying. Swimming in the lake, that's before they had built the pool.
The kids digging me.
Now, I did promise you this was not about Smallwood, so let's. By 1960, Smallwood was just one, albeit the largest as well as the oldest, of at least 11 home developments in Sullivan County. 7 of which, according to the Sullivan County Publicity and Development Committee, have been started since 1957. The notion of a resort hotel using access to its facilities to lure homeowners, later employed by the Pines, the Browns, and Kutchers, among others, actually started in 1960 with the Nemerson Hotel in South Fallsburg. Anyone know where the Nemerson is? Have you been there? Do you know what it was like? I'll tell you in a minute about it. So Nemerson was a fairly good-sized hotel. It was a medium-sized hotel, I guess. Family-owned. Pop Nemerson ran it. The owner of the Nemerson was one of the developers of Town and Country Estates, just opposite the hotel property, and it was planned that the purchase of one of the 32 home sites there would entitle the homeowner use of the hotel's entertainment and sports facilities. And in 1960, our hotels were known for their entertainment and for their sports facilities. But by 1960, some people were already beginning to notice that things were changing. Remember I said if we look back, 1958, we begin to see the unemployment rate in Sullivan County inching up every year. A lot of hotels are still doing well, they're still expanding, but most of the small and medium-sized hotels are struggling. Many of them are going out of business. By 1965, the end was obvious. By 1966, the New York Times is writing stories about all the hotels that have closed in Sullivan County. So I had an argument a few years ago with one of our county legislators. And I'm not going to mention her name because if I say Kathy, I'm sure most of you will know who I'm talking about. And she maintained she argued with me in front of a bunch of people. And by the way, I don't like people who argue with me, especially when they don't know what they're talking about. But she kept telling these folks, don't listen to that the golden age ended in 1965. I remember the 1970s, things were hopping here in Sullivan County. And I said, Kathy, by 1970, things were pretty bleak here. Yeah, we had probably 40 hotels operating in Sullivan County. That's not bad, right? 40 hotels. But that means that 500 hotels had already closed. So you're going to tell me that that's the heyday, was the 1970s? You know, some people should keep their mouths shut. At any rate, by 1960, my point is, things were starting to change, and Pop Nemerson noticed, and he begins to take action. Now, I have a friend, well, he's sort of a friend of mine, who likes to say, nothing changes if nothing changes. Pop Nemerson tried to change things. He began this idea of selling homes. It was not successful. It didn't work very well. But it started something. So for those of you who don't know the Nemerson, this is a promotional pamphlet for the Nemerson. You can see they were a pretty good sized hotel. They had an indoor pool. They didn't have a golf course, but they were one of the hotels that supported Terry Bray Golf Course under an arrangement with the town of Fallsburg. So they did kind of have their own golf course and many other amenities here. The Nemerson was a bona fide hotel. By the way, they used to advertise nude solarium. Nude solarium. The largest planned development outside of the well-established Smallwood community was no doubt that at Lake Louise Marie in Rock Hill. Now, I grew up in Rock Hill. Anyone else here from Rock Hill? Anyone know Rock Hill? You guys are from Rock Hill? Where do you live in Rock Hill? Wolf Lake, okay, good. I lived on the dead end, you know. We were the dead end kids. 1,400 homes were planned on 650 acres, and envisioned amenities included beach and dock rights on the lake, 8 community swimming pools, 8 community swimming pools, one of which was indoor, a community center, a day camp, 2 shopping centers, and a 300-room motel. By the end of the summer in 1960, about 50 homes had been completed, and although many more were built, most of the planned amenities never were. So what happened? Does anyone know what happened in 1961? Late in the year, 1961, called the Kennedy Slide. It's a major economic downturn. Credit tightened. A lot of these developments went belly up, or were scaled back severely. This is what Lake Louise Marie looked like before they came. So Lake Louise Marie is a great story, and I have to take a moment to tell you. By the way, Jonathan, if I'm overstepping my time limit here, just throw something at me, right? Because you know, when I get started, I don't stop. Am I over?
Don't sing.
John Conway can speak as long as he wants. He's too different. But when he decides that he's had enough of us, we'll take some questions at the microphone.
Oh, definitely.
And some things like that. So, John, carry on.
Okay, thanks. By the way, I was telling someone earlier at the Concord, where, by the way, I caddied for 2 days, inspired by Ray Parker. Oh, I already mentioned that. So at the Concord, they used to have a way of measuring entertainers and how bad they were. Do you know how they measured how bad an entertainer was? No. How many doors they used to get out during the show. If you had a 2-door show, that was really bad. Now I'm told, now I don't know this for a fact, but I'm told that the worst show ever at the Concord was a 4-door show. And that was Ray Charles one night. I don't know. I'm sure they told me. 4-door show. So at any rate, Lake Louise Marie, I got to tell you the story of Lake Louise Marie. So when I was a kid, long time ago, there was a popular rumor by the way, still around. And I found out more recently that it dates way back before me. That Lake Louise Marie was the former home of Al Capone. And that Lake Louise Marie was named for his wife and his girlfriend. And this rumor still exists. I don't think a week goes by that someone doesn't ask me, is that true? I've been studying Sullivan County history for 40 years, give or take. No evidence that Al Capone ever lived here. But I do know the story of how Lake Louise Marie got its name. And I know why the Al Capone rumors got started. So, Lake Louise Marie starts out, does everyone know what we're talking about, Lake Louise Marie? Yeah. So it starts out as McKee's Pond. And McKee's Pond is a little kind of a mud hole until the D&H Canal needs reservoirs to refill the canal. D&H Canal, by the way, opens in 1828. And they find pretty quickly that the canal is not watertight. You got to keep filling it up. And so they build a number of reservoirs. And they expand McKee's Pond as a reservoir for the D&H Canal. So many of the places, Wolf Lake, Yankee Lake, they're all reservoirs for the D&H Canal. So McKee's Pond was one. But in the 1930s, a guy by the name of Charles Cervanti, who operated a business called the Clam Broth House in Hoboken, New Jersey. Anyone been there? Are you guys mob tied, or? I guess you can't really tell me. At any rate, Cervanti buys the lake. And he buys all the land around the lake, Charles Cervanti. And he renames McKee's Pond Lake Louise Marie. His wife's name is Louise, and his daughter's name is Marie. And that's where the name comes from. So by the way, Cervanti and his brother have a plan. They fence in the lake, and they close it. You cannot use the lake. It's not public anymore at this point. And his brother has a little resort there called the Glory Cottage, and they entertain mostly Italian folks. I think this is where the Capone rumor comes about. And there's occasionally a shooting or so there. One ex-New York City cop got shot in the head, stuff like that. Happens everywhere. But at any rate, I think that's where the Capone rumors got started. Now, Lake Louise Marie, McKee's Pond, is only about 12 feet deep. So the notions that they dumped bodies into Lake Louise Marie are kind of ridiculous. They didn't dump any bodies, and in fact, what used to fuel a lot of those rumors was a clause in the deed that said the lake could never be drained. People said, of course, because there are all those bodies. But a few years ago, I don't know, maybe it's 10 years ago now, I lose track of time. COVID has kind of warped things for me. But sometime in the recent past, they had to repair the dam. And so they went to court to get that clause struck out. And they drained the lake. They didn't find any bodies. I think there was an airplane there, though. But at any rate, so the Capone thing, when Cervanti died, his family, his daughter's name at that point was Marie Alberghetti, Marie something. And she owned a lot of land in Sullivan County. She decided to liquidate it. It was all in her name. And she wanted to sell the lake and the land around it. And these newspaper articles started to pop up. And I found one from an Elmira newspaper that said, Al Capone's former estate in the Catskills, Lake Louise Marie, is for sale. I'm guessing that maybe Guerra had something to do with it. It was a con job, I gotta believe. But anyway, people have always talked about Capone owning the lake. He did not. But the Lake Louise Marie development was supposed to be something huge. And they did build a lot of homes. In fact, when I was a kid, in maybe 3rd or 4th grade, I had a really good friend. His name was Will Sherry. And I knew he lived in Lake Louise Marie. I didn't know much about it. And then one day, Will was gone. Whatever happened to Will? And he had a couple of brothers. and they went to Catholic school with me. Don't hold that against me. And he disappeared one day, and I found out more recently, researching things, that his dad was the sales manager for the homes at Lake Louise Marie. And after the Kennedy slide, they shut it down, they left. And they didn't build any more homes for a long time until the folks bought it, they purchased it, who had money many years later, and christened it Emerald Green, and decided to build homes. But this is what the original Lake Louise Marie homes looked like. There were a couple of versions. I think there was a 1, a 2, and a 3 bedroom. And they were mostly these summer places. A few had been winterized, I guess. But now we've got homes like this in Emerald Green. And this is kind of a common thing with the second home developments here. They start out as one thing and they kind of morph. And that's the only way they survive, because what did I tell you at the very beginning? Things change. American vacation tastes change. You've got to stay ahead of the trend. So those homes, they're not going to sell today. Those homes will sell. Now, here are some of the other developments, and I was tempted to just make a table, but I thought there was some importance to some of the amenities that were planned, because I think whether they actually get built or not, and this is true of hotel advertising, I find hotel advertising through the years is very important, even though a lot of it's embellished. You know, every hotel had an Olympic-sized swimming pool, even if they just dammed up the stream. They called it an Olympic-sized pool. But the importance of those ads when we're reconstructing the evolution is to see, well, what did they think was important to their prospective guests? That's the significance of the ad. Not whether they ever actually built it or had what they said they had, but what were they promoting that they thought would draw guests. That's what's important. And it's the same thing here. So we look here. At White Lake, a 300-acre development called Country Club Estates offered prospective home buyers a community swimming pool with a waterfall. Apparently that was a thing. And a clubhouse with a bar and coffee shop that could accommodate 700 people, as well as beach and dock rights on the lake. By August of 1960, 80 of the planned 180 homes in that development had been built. By 1960, 70 homes had been built and another 280 planned at Community Park near Mountaindale, where homeowners were to have access to a common swimming pool, a casino for dancing, concerts, and movies, and fishing and boating rights on Silver Lake. Anybody been to Silver Lake, by the way? It's not Lake Superior. Melody Lake Acres, about 5 miles from the village of Monticello, comprised 45 homes in 1960, with a total of 100 planned, and included a community pool and a casino overlooking the lake. Elsewhere in the county, 30 homes were planned for Highview Acres, a 33-acre tract near the Young's Gap Hotel outside Liberty, and 40 in Del View, a 30-acre development overlooking the Delaware River in Callicoon. Older developments in the county at the time included Feldberg Estates in Monticello, where almost all of the 70 homes were occupied year-round, and Wurtsboro Hills, where the majority of the homes, some dating back to the 1920s, were occupied only in summer. So 1960, we're still looking at developments planned, going forward, planned to be built. And then the Kennedy slide comes. And a lot of the stuff never happens. So to get back to that original timeline and what really comprised the second home tourism, it's this trend that started in 1987 when the Pines Hotel began to build the Pines Estates. And the idea was the same that Nemerson had back in 1960. Pines Estate was an idea that if you bought one of these condos, you would have access to the Pines Hotel, golf course, tennis courts, entertainment. That was the incentive to buy the homes. It was a huge development planned. And then in 1988, there's another financial downturn, and most of Pines Estates never got built. They did build quite a number of the units. So those first couple of pictures there are Pines Estates. We also have Hidden Ridge at Kutcher's. The same concept. A little bit different kind of home. But the idea was that you would buy a home and you'd have access to Kutcher's, entertainment, sports facilities, etc. And Inner Circle at Browns. The same idea. Who would have thought, if they bought a home in 1987, even though we were well past the golden age, they just couldn't conceive of the fact that before long, those hotels would not exist. No Browns, no Kutchers, no Pines. They lasted for quite a long time. They outlasted most of their contemporaries. Browns was the first to go. But these are really the three projects that started that second home tourism. We have second homes today that look like this, not all of them obviously, but that's a far cry from those Lake Louise Marine homes. And this is Chapin. We have similar homes, a few of them in Canosa Lake. There are a few developments that try to be very upscale. Obviously the ownership, prospective ownership is limited for a house like that. But we still have second home tourism here. But I think we're in a transition now and we're beginning to look at a different kind of tourism, no longer going to be dependent on second home tourism. So to go back to our timeline, obviously we're now in here. We're in a transition, at least if my timeline is accurate. And I think we are. We're feeling our way. We're deciding what do we want to be when we grow up. Are we going to have more of the destination resorts, which is what, in their great wisdom, the New York State legislature decided we needed when they put together the casino gaming legislation, which I think was the dumbest idea. They just didn't know their history. Destination resorts were a thing of the past, and yet here they are building them. People don't want that. But we're in the transition. We don't know where we're going to head, but I think it's going to be interesting. Now, if you remember that timeline, and I'll close with this. Here's the big mistake I made in the timeline, and I'm going to admit that I made a mistake. You won't often hear me say this, but I made a mistake. If you remember that original timeline, beginning, transition, silver age, transition, golden age, the mistake was that most people reading that timeline assumed, and always asked me, when is the platinum age coming? You know, the fact of the matter is there may never be a platinum age. Maybe that golden age is as good as it will ever be. I don't know. But we will have a different age. It may not be better. It just happened that the golden age was far better than the silver age. But the golden age was something extra special. I don't know that it can ever be duplicated. But I know that it will change. I just don't know whether it will be better. So that's kind of my talk tonight. I know we went the long way around to talk about second homes, but I would love to take questions if anyone has any.
Thank you for coming out, everybody, and thank you, John, so much for this presentation. Okay, so let's take some questions, and if at some point you feel you need to leave, please, head on out. But
I won't take offense.
I'm not ready. So one more time, John Conway.
I'm Jesse Rosen. First question, I have two questions. First question is, on your timeline, was there any impact in any of the story for the Woodstock Festival in '69? Did that have any perceived impact on anything in your story?
You have a second question you want to ask, or you want me to
The
answer?
second question, totally unrelated to that, is where do you see the current movement of the Hasidic communities into Sullivan County?
Okay, that's a good one. That's a good one. Okay, so let me answer your first question first, which I think is usually not the way people do it, right? Don't they always say, let me answer your second question first. I'll answer your first question first. So, no question that Woodstock had major impact on our history. Not just the 3 days, more importantly, the aftermath of it. Now, what its overall impact was on tourism here, I think is a little harder to evaluate. But think about this. Probably at least a dozen proposals that came forward in the years after Woodstock failed to come off because they could not get permits. The immediate aftermath of Woodstock was the mass gathering laws that many of the towns in Sullivan County passed and that the county board of supervisors passed. And a great example is, well, you don't have to look very far. 1970, the very next year, they proposed Bach to Rock in Mountaindale. Huge festival, summer long. Can't get permits, sues, lawsuits ensue, and so on and so forth. Never comes off. 10 years later, and I happened to be a journalist working here in Sullivan County at the time, 1979, when a man by the name of Leon Greenberg, anyone know Leon Greenberg? I'm sure someone here must have known Leon. Came forward with a proposal to utilize the old defunct Columbia Hotel property in Hurleyville. Columbia Hotel is probably the most famous Christian resort in Sullivan County. And in fact, when it closed in 1969, the Columbia Hotel was the oldest continuously operating hotel in Sullivan County. It had celebrated its Diamond Jubilee in 1966, and at that time they had unveiled big plans for expansion. By 69, they were out of business. And by the way, the property was purchased at auction by Ray Parker. Did you know that I used to caddy at the Conway? I'm inspired by Ray Parker. And Ray Parker paid $110,000 for the 200-odd acres that was the Columbia Hotel. And then Christmas Eve of 1971, there was a massive fire at the Columbia. Pretty much the whole hotel, multiple buildings burned down. But I don't know if that was connected at all. But at any rate, 1979, Leon Greenberg comes forward with a proposal to create a Tanglewood-like performing arts center at the Columbia Hotel, called the Hamlet of Hurleyville. And his slogan was, "Success is a traffic jam." Because everyone said, we don't want the roads jammed up with traffic like the Woodstock Festival. But he assured everyone, and I remember this like it was yesterday, because of the nature of the Columbia Hotel property, and I apologize, I'm rambling, but I'm going to answer your question. Because of the nature of the Columbia Hotel property, and this is true today, part of the property was in the town of Thompson, part was in the town of Fallsburg. So Leon Greenberg had to get permits from both the town of Thompson and the town of Fallsburg for his festival, as well as from the county, because they all had mass gathering laws. And he couldn't get the permits. But I remember that people were really behind Leon Greenberg in the beginning, because he was talking about lots of highbrow music coming, maybe Van Cliburn, I don't know. I'm not into music that much, but people were really behind it, and he put on a dynamite presentation. He had professional people in charge of food, security. He brought in people. They did a dynamite dog and pony show. And then someone from the audience raised their hand and asked a question, and they said, "Mr. Greenberg, are you really going to tell us that the music festival that you're preparing to do this summer is just coincidentally being proposed on the 10th anniversary of Woodstock. And immediately the air went out of the room because that was not a word you said in public back then. They mentioned the W word. And all of a sudden the mood changed. Greenberg's proposal was no longer popular with people, and it got voted down everywhere. And the Hamlin will never happen. So that's kind of impact that Woodstock had here, long after political impact of the changes on the Board of Supervisors that came about because of Woodstock. George Newhouse was reelected supervisor in Bethel, almost completely on the anti-Woodstock platform. Look what Amatucci let happen here in our town. So yeah, lots of impact. Now, what did it have to do with tourism? I'm not really sure about that. But definitely it impacted our county and probably stunted our economic growth considerably. And now I've totally forgotten what your second question was. About the house sales, yeah. I didn't take it again. I was hoping that you had. All right, so, listen. Yeah, they're here to stay. And I would say this. I think this is something to contemplate. And I got in trouble. A woman screamed at me one day, literally screamed at me at a breakfast one day because I mentioned this. But remember the timeline and the transition that I said included the influx of Jewish families into the area? So that happens primarily between 1915 and 1940. That's part of it. And the influx happened earlier than that. But it happened after the collapse of the Silver Age. We had all this land here that was, and properties that were for sale really cheap. People just wanted out. Old hotels, farms that were struggling. These Jewish immigrants came up, and sometimes with the help of the Jewish Agricultural Society, they bought up these properties. These Jewish immigrants were as different from the people who lived in Sullivan County at that time as the Orthodox who are coming here today are different from the people who live here now. They were first generation Americans or right off the boat. They were very different. They spoke differently. And that's why they couldn't go most places. The real Catskills, the Northern Catskills, would not allow them to check into a hotel there. And by the way, we have lots of telegrams and letters that went back and forth between those hotels. The Wildmere, the Cliff House, and Mohonk, and Pine Hill, that said, be on the lookout for a family that's headed your way. They will not fit in with your clientele. They dressed differently, they spoke differently, they were very different. So this is not an unprecedented move. Our golden age had collapsed. We had lots of properties that were for sale really cheaply, and that's what began bringing the Orthodox up here. When I was a kid, we had about a dozen bungalow colonies within bike riding distance of my house. I knew them all. Played ball against them, had summer romances in some of them. There was one that was Orthodox. The rest were just mainstream Jewish kids, some Italians even from New York City. Now, virtually every bungalow colony is Orthodox, right, I would say? Not all of them, but most of them. So things have definitely changed. I'm not sure where it's going, but I see that it is happening, and it's happening more and more. It's going to impact all of us. I live in Barryville. People say, oh, you're pretty isolated over there. They're not going to be over by you. Not true. It's starting to happen. So all I can say is, get used to it. But by the same token, I would tell people this: you don't have to sell. If you're that bothered by it, don't sell your property. I don't know. I'm really not sure what the answer is, but it's happening, and I guess we got to deal with it. And I think we dealt with it pretty good before, and it wasn't that bad. I know this is different, and I'm not trying to draw an exact parallel, but I think there are some similarities. Anybody else have questions? Come on. Okay, well, either it was a really good presentation or a really bad one. Seriously, thank you all for your attentiveness tonight. Thank you all. Really appreciate it. I've spent a lot of time this summer in the 18th century. I've been running Fort Delaware Museum of Colonial History. And up until about 6 o'clock tonight, I had breeches and stockings and I tried to put them out. You're laughing, but it's true. So I had to run home and take a shower. So it's a pleasure to come back and talk about more modern. I love that era, don't get me wrong. But it's always good to come out of the 18th century, at least come up for air every once in a while. Thank you, folks.
Wait 1 second. For John Conway. Why don't you take a minute and plug Fort Delaware?
Any of you know Fort? Have you been to Fort Delaware? I know Mr. Doherty was there once. Okay, so Fort Delaware. Fort Delaware is a reproduction built in the 1950s. It's a great story because America in the 1950s was rediscovering itself. And I think this ties in a little bit with what we were talking about, the evolution of the American vacation. And I'm going to go a long way around here, so I hope you'll bear with me for just a minute. A little self-promotion. So in the 1950s, America had discovered the automobile, right? We're now driving. When I was a kid, the vacation was you got in the car and you went somewhere. So all over America, we see motels being built, as opposed to these destination resorts, right? And we see theme parks and amusement parks and roadside attractions cropping up everywhere. And there was another phenomenon gripping America during the 1950s, late 1950s. Walt Disney had not only built Disney World, but he gave America something else. He gave us Davy Crockett. Every kid, including me, had a coonskin cap, right? You had one. Every kid had a coonskin cap. So a man by the name of James Burbank, who was the county historian up until 1954, he got the idea to promote local history, take advantage of America's love affair with the automobile and the Davy Crockett craze, and he builds a theme park, basically, called Fort Delaware in Narrowsburg, 1957. He does a ton of research. He actually resigns as county historian in 1954. By the way, one of the very few county historians who hasn't died in office. I have something to look forward to. But it's true. So he resigns in 54 so that he can devote his time to building Fort Delaware. He opens it in 1957, and he operates it as a private business until 1970. And by that time, he's old and infirmed, sort of like me today, and he sells the property to the county. And they operated it up until COVID, when they closed it. And I don't think they were going to reopen it. Maybe now that we had some fresh faces in there, but I don't think it was going to reopen. So in 2020, my nonprofit, the Delaware Company, which we formed back in 2012, as kind of a friends group for Fort Delaware and other historic attractions, we took over. We made a deal with the county. And we made a deal with the county that we would take over the fort and we would bankroll it. We would put up the money. Cost the county nothing. Well, they maintain the property, so I can't say it cost them nothing. But they don't have operating costs of the fort. The nonprofit that I head up bears all the costs. We hire, train, and pay the staff. We pay for the lights and the insurance and the water and sewer, everything. At any rate, so it's a replica, a reproduction of the first European Sullivan in the Upper Delaware, called Cushiton. established in the 1750s by a group of farmers from eastern Connecticut who wanted to own their own land. They're Yankees. They wanted to own property. There was very little farmland available in eastern Connecticut at the time, and so they petitioned the colonial governor to move farther west in their same colony, because Connecticut believed they owned not just the land to the Delaware River, but the land on the other side of the Delaware River. I don't know if anyone here knows this, but Connecticut and Pennsylvania actually fight 3 wars over who owns the land that we today call Wayne and Pike County. They're called the Pennamite Wars, or the Pennamite-Yankee Wars. So they thought they were still in Connecticut. They come here and they purchased 30 miles of riverfront from some local Native Americans. They call their settlement Cushitunk, which is kind of the English interpretation of the Native American word for the region. And they established this settlement. And they build it. They solicit more families come. And by the way, one of the things we're researching right now, because we really don't have a lot of details, but one of the names on the original deed, there was a group, this group of farmers called themselves the Delaware Company, which is also, by the way, the name of our nonprofit, the Delaware Company of New York. But this original Delaware Company, when they bought the land from the Native Americans, one of the signatories on that deed is Benedict Arnold. Now, we know it's not the general, because the years don't work, but we think our best estimate at this point in time, and as I said, we're still researching it, but we're pretty sure that it was the general's father. And if you know his story, you know that he was a speculator. He did a lot of speculating and became a drunkard when one of his children died. And he dissipates the family fortune, which is why Benedict Arnold, the trader, had this chip on his shoulder his whole life, because he felt like he'd been cheated out of his inheritance. But anyway, so Cushitunk existed from 1755 or so until just after the Revolutionary War. And here's why it no longer existed after that. As the Revolutionary War approaches, the settlers choose up sides. Some of them become patriots, some remain loyalists. And in fact, even within some of the families, the Skinner family, for example, 2 sons fought for the British, and at least one son fought the Continental Army, fought against each other. At the Battle of Minisink in July 1779, there were men from the Cushitunk settlement on both sides, British and the colonial militia. At any rate, they choose up sides as the Revolutionary War approaches. The Patriots mostly leave because this is not a safe place for them, because there are more loyalists, and the Native Americans who are traveling through here on a regular basis because of the river are almost all loyal to the British. Not because they believed in the British or that they didn't think that the colonists deserved independence, but because they thought it's probably better for us if the British win, because their government's 3,000 miles away, 10,000, whatever it is, rather than having a government right here. Anyway, it was dangerous to the Patriots. They leave. So the settlement is now in the hands of the Loyalists. So it's never attacked by Joseph Grant and his men during the war. It's intact. But those Patriots come back from time to time, burn down houses, kill families. There are atrocities on both sides. Then the war ends, and in case you didn't know, the British lose. And now the Loyalists no longer want to live here. It's not safe for them. They were on the wrong side. So they leave. And the settlement is largely abandoned. So Cushitunk has a lifespan of 1755 to 1785. And that's the story we tell at Fort Delaware today. So we have docents in period dress. We have several stations throughout the settlement. It is a stockade that was built for protection around a portion of the Cushitunk settlement. It was known as the Lower Fort. And Burbank did a lot of research so that the dimensions are exact and so on. So we tell a lot of stories there. We talk about agriculture, we talk about the apothecary, we talk about the public house, we talk about the blacksmith, candle making, spinning and weaving, so on and so forth, depending on the day and who's there and what programs we have. That's Fort Delaware. We'd welcome you all to come out. We're open Thursday through Sunday through Labor Day. Our next big program, we had a great program today about the Lenape Native Americans. Our next big program is Labor Day weekend. We're going to have a story about Robert Land, who was the Justice of the Peace in the Cushitung Sullivan, becomes a spy for the British during the Revolutionary War, is captured several times, and at least once is sentenced to be hanged, and George Washington himself intervenes, saves his life. Robert Land's story is a great story, much beyond what I just told you, and that's the story on Labor Day weekend. That Saturday I'll be doing it. It's called the Cushitung Spy. So please, I'd like to see you all at Fort Delaware. Thank you, Jonathan, for having me tonight. I think he stuck out without telling us.